My name is Narce Caliva. I'm a native Californian. I was born in Salinas, Monterey County, California.
Monterey.
Actually, in the year of the great Wall Street crash, 1929.
1929. What month?
September.
And what day?
September 7th, 1929. I was born and raised in California,
Right.
and after I graduated from junior college there, I joined the Army.
What college?
Salinas Junior College.
I'm sorry?
Salinas Junior College.
What did you study?
Business management. My father was a small business owner, and so I skipped a couple grades, and so I graduated from junior college when I was 18.
When was that?
1948.
Oh.
And they were still drafting 19 to 25-year-olds. So in several months, I turned 19 and decided I'd enlist in the Army for 3 years.
1949.
1948.
48.
Uh-huh. So I enlisted for 3 years in November 1948. And my enlisted service was really at Fort Eustis, Virginia, where I was in the military police detachment.
I see.
And then in about 15 months or so, I decided I really liked the Army. So I applied for officer candidate school and was accepted. And on my way to OCS, which was in Fort Riley, Kansas, the Korean War started, 1950.
There are not many college graduates at the time who enlisted
Right.
Army, right?
Right.
So you are one of the most well-educated.
Well, I only had the 2 years of college, and the classmates that I had were returning veterans from World War II, or else people who had just graduated from high school.
I see, yeah.
So that was an interesting mix.
Yeah.
But I decided I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I got out of college, so I thought I'd join the Army and do my service and then find out what it was all about. So I went into the Army. I was selected for OCS. On the way to OCS, the Korean War broke out, but I did go ahead and graduate and was commissioned as second lieutenant in the Transportation Corps in January 1951. And then after some further training, I was put in the Transportation Corps, so I was sent back to Fort Eustis, Virginia, for further training, and my first assignment was to Korea. Most of my classmates were sent to Korea.
What do you do? I mean, for the audience, what did you take care of in transportation department? What do you do?
I was a truck officer when I was actually running convoys, ammunition, supplies, troops to the front lines. And
you yourself drove the truck?
No, I was a platoon leader. I was a first lieutenant. I'd been promoted.
Yeah.
And so I usually led convoys of 15 to 20 trucks northward. We were stationed at Wonju, which was the end of the rail line in Korea at that time. And so all of the supplies would be sent by rail up to Wonju, and we would send our trucks there, pick up all the supplies, and go ahead and deliver them north.
So you were supervising this convoy?
Yes.
Right.
Leading the convoy.
Did you know anything about Korea when you were about to finish the officer school?
Nothing. No, nothing.
Even in the college, you were one
well,
of
I
the
mean,
most highly educated
I was
among this GI.
I was aware that South Korea was a country and existed, and because of my own heritage, my father was an immigrant from the Philippines. And came to the United States and became a U.S. naturalized citizen. So
when did he emigrate?
He left the state. He left the Philippines when he was a boy, in his teens, and he was one of those in the great migration of workers to Hawaii and to the States where they worked on the plantations. So he he left when he was a boy, went to Hawaii, worked there for several years, saved up his money, and then moved to California. My mother's family, they were immigrants from the former Yugoslavia. And so they came to the States. My mother was born in the States, and so I was born in California. It was the midsummer of 1951. I left, it was sometime in early July of 1951.
Early July.
I was on a troop ship out of Seattle, and this troop ship went from Seattle to Yokohama, and we offloaded. I was further processed in Japan, took the train down to Sasebo, and took an overnight ferry with all the other replacements to Busan.
When was that? When did you arrive in Busan?
It was either the late July or the 1st of August, not quite sure, of 1951. Now, an interesting thing about my assignment when I first arrived there was I was sent to the Transportation Corps headquarters, and they asked me whether or not I minded serving with a colored truck battalion, because the U.S. Armed Forces were still segregated at that time. So they had segregated truck battalions with black enlisted and mixed officers. So I was assigned to one of those battalions in one of those companies.
You didn't mind?
No, I grew up in a very mixed neighborhood in California.
Very nice.
So I actually looked forward to it.
Good.
All of my friends when I was growing up were mixed, because they were Filipino, Chinese, American, white, Caucasian, Hispanic, all in one place. So I was happy to go to a truck battalion like that. And after only several months, then the desegregation order came down, and so they mixed the units. This was in the fall of 1951.
Desegregation policy?
Right. President Truman had signed the desegregation orders, and so I was assigned to a different company in the same battalion, where they mixed them up, and they were anticipating problems, but we really did not have very many problems of integration. But I was up at Wonju for about 9 months, early 1952, the spring of 1952.
What was your major mission again?
Moving supplies, people, ammunition, food, clothing, the whole business because what happens in those situations is that for every fighting person whose job it is in infantry to fight every day, there are probably 8, 9, 10 people backing that person up in different kinds of support or specialty roles. And so that's what we were. We were in direct support of the troops who were doing the fighting.
What was the most important items that you used to distribute?
Ammunition, bringing replacements, the food, clothing, the everyday items that just kept the Army on the move.
Then you must have a big warehouse there.
Well, no, actually we were at Wonju, which is the end of the rail line.
Right.
So everything was shipped to Wonju, and that was the end of the line. And so I was in a company, there were several companies around like that. We had, for example, 48 trucks in our company. But there were several companies like that, and we were all the time picking up supplies and driving them north. The worst part of that, or the most challenging part of that in the winter, was that it was the coldest winter of my life. It went as low as 35, 40 degrees below zero. Some of the roads there were very narrow. Some of them were just really new roads cut out of the side of mountains to go north. And so when it froze and the ice covered it over, We lost a few trucks because of the treacherous condition of the roads, and they would just simply slide off the edge. We didn't lose any drivers because at the last moment they would jump for their lives.
Good.
But that was, and occasional, they had occasional sniper fire, but that was just random.
So the most danger was not enemy bullet, but it was the road condition and the weather.
It was the challenge of doing that day after day after day and keeping this supply route open so that the people could continue the fighting up north.
Those items delivered from Busan?
Yes, they all came in from supplies that came in mainly through the port at Busan.
Did we have any protection security forces around the railroad area?
Well, we were all armed, of course.
But it's a long railway from Busan to Wonju, and
Right.
I don't know how they secure this safety there.
That was it. When I first arrived in Korea and was assigned from Busan, they sent me first to Daegu en route and by train, and then from Daegu on up to Wonju by train. But all along that route, occasionally they would fire at us. But see, generally we were then at that point, a year into the war, we were starting to really defend ourselves. And so there were no large masses of forces along that route. They were all up along the demilitarized military zone, the DMZ, the fighting zone.
Were you in that convoy truck, or you were in the jeep in front of it, or did you work in the backside of the headquarters?
No, I was in a jeep. I led the convoys in a jeep, and
Front?
because I was the one with the map, and I knew where we were supposed to go. And occasionally you would arrive there and find that there was no one there because the unit had already moved, the fighting unit had already moved. So then in the spring of 1952, that unit that I was in was transferred down to Busan to a different battalion with a new mission. And that mission was to help provide local transportation services in the Busan area. So when I moved with that unit back down, and by the way, one of the units that I was with had been a unit that had been up north at the Chosin Reservoir, and it had come back, and some of the survivors of that particular company were still in that unit when I joined that unit. It was a presidential unit, citation unit. But in the spring, they moved that unit down to Busan. And so I moved with that unit to Busan. And in Busan, it was not, because we were providing local services like bus services and so forth, it was not as, what shall I say, not as challenging or as dangerous or as extreme as being up at Wonju. So at that time, then, they gave me additional duties, battalion duties. For example, I was designated the battalion legal officer, which meant that for the special court marshals, I became the trial counsel or the prosecutor.
Ah, that's an interesting career there.
And this was an additional duty. And it was because, and I prosecuted 37 cases successfully and got convictions, and one defense case I had. But it was because a lot of accidents occurred with vehicles. Some of our U.S. forces would, by accident, they would either have accidents or they would run across property or run across people. And some of these were criminal in nature, or seemed to be, so they were tried in a special court martial.
Because you had such an experience.
There they appointed me the prosecutor of these cases as an additional duty.
Prosecutor, not counselor.
Well, the title is trial counsel. And so the trial counsel is the prosecutor for special court martials. The other thing that was interesting is they also have general court martials, which are, of course, for larger crimes. And in those days, a lieutenant like myself who was not a lawyer could be assigned and serve as an assistant trial counsel for the general court marshals. And that was really quite an experience. So I did not actually prosecute, but I was more or less in charge of all of the logistics for setting up the general court martial, making sure we had the witnesses and the facilities and so on. So that was an interesting experience.
Yeah, it is.
Now, there's one other one I have to tell you about. Because of all of this experience, in 1949, the United States government signed the Geneva Conventions. And it was a while before it was ratified by the Senate. But one of the provisions of that signing of the conventions was that any prisoners of war, if there was any alleged mistreatment of prisoners of war, these instances were to be investigated by the detaining power.
Yeah.
So Headquarters 8th Army and the UN forces had a prisoner of war camp on Koji Island. There were about 35,000 prisoners there. And there were a few already instances or complaints of alleged mistreatment that had been reported by the International Red Cross. So Headquarters 8th Army appointed a board of inquiry of 17 officers, of which I was one as a junior officer. And we were sent to Koji Island for several months to investigate these cases. And that was an interesting experience to me because I was able to observe the work of the International Red Cross, and it actually fueled my desire to be of service. And that's what determined my future career, my main career in life. So after that experience, I went back, finished my tour, came back in the spring of 1953, actually to the States. And I had 2 brief assignments before I was released from active duty. One was as an ROTC instructor at Washington Lee University, just briefly, and then I was at Fort McPherson in Atlanta, which was Headquarters 3rd Army. And then I was released early in order to return to school under the GI Bill. They had a new regulation that came out in 1953 that said that any officer who had completed a combat tour overseas, had finished at least 3 years of service, and who could be accepted by an accredited university or college, could be released early to return to study. So I applied, and I was immediately accepted. So I was released in September 1953, and went back and immediately started finishing my junior and senior years at Sacramento State College in California. And then I went on to a year of graduate work, and I graduated from Thunderbird, which is now Thunderbird School of Global Management. I got my first jobs, which were in New York and in the Midwest with a couple of international firms. But then I decided I really wanted to do something where I could travel overseas, maybe something with the military, use my education, and so on. And so I found the American Red Cross, which had a Service to Armed Forces program. And so I joined that program and spent a 30-year career with the American Red Cross. Much of it in the Service to Armed Forces branch of the Red Cross. That included, for example, 4 more overseas assignments with the military. And so I, during the course of my career, I've been stationed in Spain, Germany twice, Japan, Vietnam, and I ended my career as managing director in Europe, and retired in 1989.
Very interesting career. So the whole service and education actually had a good positive impact on your
It did.
life.
It did.
Uh-huh.
When I went to Korea, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't realize how big the world was and that there were other people out there who were also, in need of help and seeking the same sort of values and goals in life. And I came to know that the Korean people were, a very kind and generous people, and that's certainly been held true through all the years. The Korean people have been extremely appreciative of the services of all of the countries who came and helped during the Korean War.
Let me go back to your Busan and Goje Island
Okay.
period. What was the typical criminal case at the time?
Oh, in the special court martials, primarily it was speeding. I mean, most of the time the drivers were speeding, and occasionally a few of them, that because of that they had accidents or caused damage. In one case, for example, they put a person in the hospital, ran over their stand, and so on. So those were, you might say, small or medium type. If it was really a criminal case like drugs or narcotics or say murder or one of those types of things, that would generally be going to a general court martial.
Were there many cases of drug use?
Of any number of large numbers of people, there are, just like in any community, there was going to be an occasional murder or something of that nature, or stealing, or and so those were occasional cases. They were not, every day. Although I will say that even way back then, there was some noticeable use of drugs, narcotics, by the troops, and part of that was enemy inspired in the sense that drugs would be provided to the troops by enemy forces.
By enemy forces?
Well, for example, through prostitutes or other, it was one of the methods of say, attacking UN forces. When we got there, we had about 35 cases, and we were divided into 3 teams, and our team had about 35 cases that we looked at. We found no instances in which the United Nations forces were at fault. What happened, the typical case would be some internee or some prisoner of war had disappeared. They simply were not there anymore, and people wondered, well, what happened to them? And it may have been that they were not part of the group thinking that way, and they were people in charge within the prisoner group decided to get rid of them. And what we learned through a lot of interviews and so forth was that very often the people who were interviewed were killed and were cut up into small pieces and were carried out with the honey buckets. And therefore, they completely disappeared. There was no sign left of them. And this came from the testimony of the prisoners that we interrogated or questioned.
Was that mostly North Korean or the Chinese or the South Koreans?
They were both. They had Chinese and North Korean prisoners there.
And Chinese also killed each other inside, or instance that you just introduced to me.
Yeah, mostly North Korean, I think.
Mostly North Korean.
Yeah.
So these North Korean groups, they treated badly the person who's been interviewed, so that.
No, they had already found people within their group of prisoners who were right or who didn't believe with them or didn't support them, and so they got rid of them. And so by the time we got there, our job was to question and find out, well, what happened to these, because these were alleged mistreatment under the Geneva Conventions, and so we made reports, went to our commands and to the International Red Cross. And as I say, we found no instances where we could find anything that the United Nations were at fault.
What was the scene that you remember of the Gaze Island as a prisoner of war camp?
What I remember was we had 35,000 prisoners in several camps, and that it looked to me like the security was minimal, because we only had, for example, guard towers on corners. We only had an occasional soldier walking with a rifle, and it seemed to me pretty clear that the prisoners could probably have broken out any time they wanted to. In sheer numbers of prisoners, they could have overwhelmed these few defenses. That's what I think. And there was an international incident where I don't know if you're aware of this, but the commander of the United Nations prisoner of war camp was himself captured by the prisoners and dragged into the compound.
Yep.
That happened just a few weeks after our work was done and we had left.
Oh boy.
So that shows you how, I guess, and what happened there was, after a lot of negotiations and so forth, some combat troops were sent in, and they actually entered the compound and rescued the general and so on. But it did not turn out to be a good incident for the United States.
What is the scene you remember overall about Korea?
I can just remember it as a great adventure I had, because I was a young man. It opened my eyes to the world. I enjoyed, actually, despite everything that happened, it was really one of the greatest adventures of my life.
Korea was devastated by the time.
Yes, yes. And I returned to Korea 18 years later, because by that time I had been in the Red Cross, I had risen through the ranks, I had now become assistant director in the Far East out of Japan, and my responsibility was Korea. We had 17 offices there. So I returned to Korea on inspection visits to my offices with the U.S. troops, and I had a chance then to see a Korea that I never knew existed. I mean, it was, completely transformed from just nothing to now a metropolis. And I mean, when I had not gotten to Seoul when I was in Korea the first time, but when I went back, then I went everywhere that I had been before. I went back to Daegu. We had offices at Daegu, at Busan, Seoul, and a number of other places. So I went to all of those places, and as I say, it was completely different from what I remembered. And remembering too that in my role there, it was really rather limited, because I got up every day, ran my convoys. I didn't really have a chance to wander around or anything. I was focusing on duty all of the time I was there.
Why the Korean War has been said to be forgotten?
I think because the Great War was during the time I was in high school, during the 1940s. And it started only 5 years after World War II was over, and people were not of a mind to think about another war at that time. It was also called at that time a United Nations police action. It was not really considered a war. And so we went in to police it, but it turned out to be a war. And in one of the bloodiest wars in U.S. history, because by virtue of comparing the number of deaths to the number We had more losses during that war than any other war that we've had, and the people really were not aroused and supporting it like they were in World War II. When I came home and got off the ship, I came back on a troop ship again, landed at Seattle. They had a small band playing. That was it. Went out to the airport, flew to San Francisco. My father met me at the airport. We went home, and that was it. That was, nobody was talking about the war. I just went home and said, what's my next assignment going to be, I wonder? And that was it. And so people have sort of put it out of their memory. It was a minor war to many people. And it was not really considered a war until later, I did meet a girl when I graduated from OCS and was commissioned. I met this girl who became a pen pal, I thought. We corresponded all the time that I was in Korea. And one of the first things I did when I got back from Korea was to go to Chicago and look her up to see if, maybe this is something that can be serious. And it turned out that she was just trying to be a good pen pal.
That's it.
That's it, yeah.
Do you still keep that letters?
I don't have any of those letters anymore.
How do you assess the legacy of the Korean War and the Korean War veterans?
It was a good thing that we went. It was the first test of combined strengths of nations, say the United Nations, to try to stop aggression. That is looking at it in retrospect. You understand that when I went to Korea, I went simply because it was my duty. Mm-hmm. I had no other motivation. People talk about going for one reason or another. I went simply because I was a soldier. That was my assignment, and that's where I went. It was after I got there that you begin to find out and develop all of these other ideas. But it was in retrospect a war, I think, that needed to be fought, that has had a good result, and I still hope that someday the Koreas can be unified, but that's up to them, and we don't know what's going to happen. But you've seen this around the world, even in the United States, North and South had its problems, but we've reconciled. Well, perhaps someday, I'd like to see that.
Any message to young generation?
The Korean War Veterans Association has a program called Tell America, and I'm an active participant in that. And every time, and we have gone recently to programs, and every time I go, I tell one of the same messages that I give is that one of the things you must do in your life is find a way to be of service to others. You don't necessarily have to be in the military, but you need to serve your government and your country in some way, find a way to help your fellow man. And you need to get a good education in order to do this. Mm-hmm. And if you do these things, then you'll have a better, more successful life. Mm-hmm. And try to open your eyes to other things beyond yourself. And they seem to eat it up.
What do you want to say about your experience in the Red Cross?
I enjoyed every day of it. Some days more than others, but it was a wonderful experience. I believe in that organization. I believe it exists to help people.
What do we need to do more Red Cross successful?
It needs support. The Red Cross, like a lot of large organizations, is sometimes misunderstood, and it sometimes has people or incidents that are not necessarily the best, but its intentions are good, its results are good, and the world needs the Red Cross because It is one of the few organizations that can talk Red Cross to Red Cross or Red Crescent throughout the world. Now, sometimes the governments cannot talk to each other, but the Red Cross and the Red Crescent can talk to each other. My other major project is the Korean War Veterans Association. I had never joined an organization, a veterans organization before, because I was always busy with Red Cross and so forth. But 2 years ago, a friend invited me and I joined the Korean War Veterans Association chapter here. And I had not intended to be anything more than a member, but after my first year, they approached me about a leadership position. So I've been the first vice commander of the chapter here for the last 2 years. And that means that I have an opportunity to run for commander next year.
I'm going to be the commander.
I am not decided yet whether, but it is one of my major interests now, and because we are building this war memorial in Jim Barnett Park. After that is built, then I'm not sure what our next major projects will be, but I will remain active as a Korean War veteran.
Your name in Korean, Narce Caliva. Again, thank you very much for your service.
You're very welcome.